So you wake up and then you think to yourself, okay, I have a 1,800 calorie limit for the whole day. And then you wake up and then you think to yourself, okay, what should I have for breakfast? What's gonna fit between my limit? Okay, I had 200 calories for breakfast. Okay, what am I gonna have for lunch? You just over obsess about how many calories you're gonna be eating. You over obsess about what foods you're gonna be eating for the next day, then the next day, and then the next day. And then you're just always thinking about food. Sometimes you even like go to sleep thinking about food, or you dream about what you're gonna be eating. Sometimes you have food dreams, or sometimes you just wake up because you're constantly thinking about food. In this video, I'm gonna be explaining why you can't stop thinking about food and how you can stop thinking about food 24/7. So number one reason why you can't stop thinking about food 24/7 can be explained using the Minnesota starvation experiment. So the Minnesota starvation experiment is one of the best, or one of the most unethical, shall I say, studies on starvation, which happened in the 1940s. So the Minnesota starvation experiment was conducted. What would happen if you starved men to eat half of their calorie requirements for a long period of time? What would happen to them physically and mentally? So the men in the Minnesota starvation experiment were actually normally eating 3,000 calories because they're quite fit and they're working in the military. Anything not related to food, their brains would just be very ambivalent. They won't even think about anything. They had no interest other than food. They're constantly dreaming about food. They'd wake up at night because they're constantly craving for food. They even found that some people were actually eating out of trash cans, getting out leftovers, fighting for food, getting really aggressive. So the Minnesota starvation experiment really explains how people can actually develop depression, anxiety, mania, constant food thoughts, obsessive food thoughts, which would cause their mental health to massively deteriorate. So what we can learn from the Minnesota starvation experiment is that if we undereat calories, if we eat less than our body requires for a long period of time, aka if you go on a very strict diet for a long period of time, then you'll be constantly thinking about food. And it's not because you're only restricting food that you're thinking about it more. It's because your body goes into this survival mode, like it thinks that there's a famine going on, because our brains can see the food in front of us, but our stomachs can't recognize that there's food in front of us, or that there's food in the cupboard or the fridge. So our body goes into, okay, we need to survive, we need to find food ASAP, we need to do everything. Let's ramp up those hunger cues. Let's ramp up the ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, which makes you more hungry. Let's think about food more and more and more. Let's occupy the brain more about food, 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 food. When can I get food? How can I get food? Which food should I eat? And sometimes you feel even compelled that if you have intense cravings, you feel compelled as if you're being possessed to order delivery online, order food delivery, McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, all those kinds of things. So the Minnesota starvation experiment explains how physical restriction, aka undereating for a long period of time, can make you feel possessed to want to think about food more often. And what's really important here is that when people go on very restrictive diets, they try to volume eat. So volume eat is trying to fill your stomach up as much as possible by trying to have as little calories as possible. So sometimes you might have to go on a very high fiber diet, have very high protein. So what happens is you try to fill up your stomach with as much volume as possible. So very high fiber foods, very high protein foods, sugar sweetened beverages. Because when your stomach expands, your body senses the stretch response and then triggers the leptin, which is the hunger hormone. But that's a completely different response compared to your body sensing how many calories are eaten throughout the day. So although your stomach expands, it is going to unexpand. It's going to like shrink back again, and that's when the cravings are gonna come in like crazy. So it's important to eat enough calories throughout the day to prevent binge eating episodes. So if ever you're gonna go on a calorie deficit, aim for a 300 calorie deficit, or maybe 500 as a higher end of a calorie deficit. So now moving on to number two, we're gonna be talking about the forbidden fruit effect. So the forbidden fruit effect describes that anything which seems to be unavailable is, as a result, more desirable. So an example for this is Rolex watches. The reason why they're massively expensive is because they stopped producing them and there's very limited stock of certain Rolex watches. This applies to anything in life, law of supply and demand, but most importantly, this applies to food. So if you restrict yourself from, let's say, peanut butter, or restrict yourself from all sugar, then you're gonna want to crave sugar even more. And I know there are studies that show that if you avoid sugar, processed sugar, for a long period of time, you're much less likely to want them. But that's a mechanical and a physiological point of view. You're still going to want some kind of sugar throughout the day. So I know people in the comments are going to be saying, yeah, I cut out sugar from my life and now I'm not craving it as much anymore, which is amazing. But it's important to realize that food is not just about sugar, but sometimes you might have an affinity or a nostalgic memory with those kinds of foods. So I love chocolate spread, but if I cut out all chocolate spread from my life and I have a nostalgic memory and I want to crave my nostalgic wanting by just simply having some chocolate spread, then I'm gonna have it. If I want that chocolate spread and I avoid it as much as possible, even though I have a nostalgic memory attached to it, then I'm gonna want it even more. It's like an itch that you need to scratch. So it's great that you should try to swap refined sugars for maybe a more natural sugar, such as like dates and honey and all those kinds of things. But remember that if we have extreme restriction of your most favorite foods, then you're gonna want them even more. The same goes with the opposite, that if you eat too much peanut butter, for example, even though you like peanut butter, then you're not going to want it as much anymore. So the forbidden fruit effect can go both ways. If you avoid something, you're going to want it more. If you have too much of it, then you're not going to want it as much. So next time you're constantly thinking about a very specific food, think to yourself, is the forbidden fruit effect in play? Am I avoiding it as much as possible? So now moving on to number 3 is survivalistic thinking. So we think to ourselves, okay, so there's no food going on, there's no food available, so survival mechanism kicks in. I want food as much as possible. You'll be hunting for food. Your body is still in this caveman mode or cavewoman mode where you think, okay, if there's no food around, then I need to search for food. I'm gonna ramp up those hunger hormones as much as possible. I'm gonna ramp up ghrelin. I'm gonna trigger my brain to think about food more often, just like we talked with number 1. So you're gonna want to have food more and more often. If we think about the caveman era, we didn't have fridges, we didn't have ways to preserve our food. We probably ate nothing for breakfast, maybe berries for lunch, and then we'd hunt a mammoth. Then we'd have a massive quote-unquote binge eating episode on that mammoth, and then we'd be satisfied for a long period of time. So if you're trying to avoid food for a long period of time, undereat for a long period of time, then your body's naturally going to want to binge eat. I'm using quotation marks because back then binge eating is by definition characterized by guilt, and back then people were just eating large amount of food and hopefully they didn't have any guilt eating a large mammoth. They'd be massively happy just eating that mammoth. So if you try to avoid food for a long period of time, you're gonna want to crave it even more. So if you're constantly having massive cravings in the evenings for a large amount of food, constantly binge eating, try to split your meals throughout the day. Try to focus on mechanical eating. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Try to eat regularly throughout the day. So instead of having nothing for breakfast and lunch and a massive craving in the evening, then try to split those calories by having medium breakfast, medium lunch, and a medium dinner. What happens here is when you're splitting out all these calories, your body is gonna not have this survivalistic mindset being triggered. It's not gonna trigger a famine response like, oh, I need to look for food crazy amounts. And it might sound a bit strange that you're splitting all those calories throughout the day, and you might be thinking, oh, Jonathan, I'm gonna eat so much food. But if you think about it, if you skip breakfast, skip lunch, and then the evening, we're gonna want to binge on cookies, cakes, donuts, brownies, pizzas, all those kinds of things. Those foods are lower volume, high calorie, and it's easy to overeat on them, and you're gonna normally be on a massive surplus compared to eating meals which are breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they contain protein, fats, carbs, and fiber, which is going to keep you full for a long period of time, and you're much less likely to overeat in a surplus. So if you want to know what your meal should look like, if you want to learn how to overcome binge eating cravings and prevent these cravings happening throughout the day, I highly recommend that you check the plate by plate approach, which I'll be linking in the description of this video. It's an Instagram page, and it's led by amazing people where they just essentially show their meals of them following the plate by plate approach. So I'll be popping here a few examples of them following the plate by plate approach. So they're gonna be meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. You can find more in the link in the description. I highly recommend you check those because those are meals which are actually balanced, and they created this plate by plate approach to teach people what portions should look like and what meals should look like to prevent eating disorders from cropping up, to help people build a nutritional balanced meal which is also filling and, more importantly, satisfying. There's a difference between being full and satisfied. You need to be full and satisfied with these meals to prevent cravings much later on. On a side note, if you're really enjoying this video right now and you're learning a lot from it, then check the link in the description for my binge eating masterclass, which is a free hour-long masterclass on how to overcome binge eating urges and create a healthy, nourishing, enjoyable diet which can fit to your goals without having any annoying cravings in the evening, annoying cravings going on, without having 24/7 food thoughts non-stop throughout the day, especially in the evening, especially before bed, and you're constantly thinking about food, overthinking, binge eating, cravings during these diets. And what I tell clients is, if you overcome binge eating and cravings, whatever diet you follow, you're not going to be the 95% of people that are going to be failing these diets. You're going to be the 5% that are actually going to stick to it, because the reason 95% of diets fail is because people can't stick to them, because they fall into this binge eating trap, which I explained in the masterclass. So check that in the link in the description. It's free and it's freely available to watch. It just leads you to this unlisted YouTube video link to the free binge eating masterclass. So check that out. And now moving on to number 4. So number 4 reason why you can't stop thinking about food is because you're constantly adding morality to foods. You're calling foods good, bad, sinful, angelic, junk, clean, all these things that add morality, that there's two extremes. There's either good foods or bad foods, or sinful foods or angelic foods. When you have these two extremes, you're adding morality to foods, then you're gonna want the same thing with the forbidden fruit effect. You're gonna want more of those bad foods because you think, oh, it's a naughty treat. Oh, I've been good, I'm gonna have these treats, instead of seeing them as all equal. So I know you're gonna say like, yeah, not all food are equal, some good or some bad. That's actually not true. So there's no good, there's no bad, but there is more nutritious and less nutritious foods, because all foods have a reason. They all have a place in our lives. So let's say, for example, you might see orange juice and gummy bears, which are high in sugar, as bad. But for someone who has type 1 diabetes, those are good, and they can be life-saving treatment to prevent hypoglycemia or very low blood sugars, which could cause them to go into hospital if they're constantly low in blood sugars. Let's use another example about avoiding good and bad foods. So let's say someone has cancer and they had chemotherapy and it's affecting their taste. They have a metallic taste in their throat. They have a metallic taste in the tongue as well, and they have almost no appetite. Cakes, cookies and brownies, although not nutritionally dense, have the calories to prevent them from being in a calorie deficit to make them lose muscle. So sometimes you just need that little push. So there's no good, no bad, but there's less nutritious, more nutritious. Less nutritious would be like your cookies, chocolates, brownies, not much vitamins and minerals. But the more nutritious would be like salad, salmon, broccoli. So we're focusing on the micronutrients as well. So there's no good, no bad. But it's important to recognize the difference that all foods fit. And if you want certain foods, you need to understand that each food has a specific purpose. If you're constantly calling foods good and bad, then whenever you think of yourself inherently, emotionally as a bad person, let's say you hurt someone's feelings, then you're just gonna want to lean into those bad foods naturally because you're linking those emotions to the food. We need to unlink all of that and change our language around food. Less nutritious, more nutritious. Number 5 is the reason why you're constantly thinking about food is because you have this all or nothing mindset. So we think about being on a diet as on and off. On a diet, off a diet. We're on a diet on the weekdays and then Saturdays, oh, that doesn't count. I'm off that diet. I'm gonna have a cheat day. So if you have this all or nothing mindset, then you're constantly gonna be thinking about food non-stop because you're either on or off a diet. When you're on a diet, you're being really strict. You're thinking about all the foods that you wish you could have. When you're off a diet, well, obviously you're already thinking about the cookies, cakes, and brownies on your cheat days. We need to change this into a lifestyle. If we change it into a lifestyle and try to make it as automatic as possible, or just natural and easy to follow, create habits around it, instead of thinking, oh, I'm gonna try my best to stick to this diet, I'm gonna try my best to avoid all these kinds of foods, then you're much less likely to think about it. Just like brushing your teeth. Hopefully, that you brush your teeth regularly, it becomes automatic. Maybe when you try to introduce it first, when we were young, we really hated brushing our teeth, or maybe me, I hated brushing my teeth when I was much younger. But the more you try to implement these lifestyle changes, trying to add more fruit and veg to your meals, make them more whole with protein, fats, carbs, and fiber, trying to implement them into more of the my plate approach kind of meals and plates, then when it's more of a habit rather than using constant willpower and fighting your way through this diet, then there's much less friction. And when there's less friction, you don't really think too much about it, and you're not going to be thinking about food as much. So let's try to avoid this all or nothing mindset. And I know it's really cheesy, everyone says, but we should try to make it a lifestyle, because when it's a lifestyle, the thing most people don't say is that you don't really think too much about it. You don't over-obsess about it. And when you're not over-obsessing, then you're much less likely to binge eat and have intense cravings. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I highly recommend that you check this video if you enjoyed me talking about all the things that could lead you to overeat and think about food 24/7. Hopefully after implementing all of these and understanding all of these, then you won't be thinking about food 24/7, which could make you have more food anxiety, and it's a terrible cycle leading to binge eating. Food anxiety, guilt, binge eating, diet, it's a never-ending cycle, and it's a terrible cycle. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya!